Kia ora, I'm Debbie Hager. I'm the Disability Portfolio Holder for Tuanest. Welcome to all of you. Thank you for coming to this. I'd like to hand over to Ruth to open for us and start our session.
Kia ora, my name is Ruth Tison de Qureshi. I am the ethnic portfolio holder for the Tawiwi Caucus in Tuanes, and co-facilitating this session with Debbie. Karakia. Whakata taka te aho ki te uru. Whakata taka te aho ki te tonga. Kia manaki na kina ki Utah. Kia ratatara kia tai. Ehi ake ana te ata kura. He tio, he huka, he hau, hu, he Maori ora. I leave you now with Debbie to present the following stage.
Thank you. Thanks, Ruth, for opening for us, and welcome to you all. A little bit of housekeeping. You'll all be muted. This is not an interactive webinar, so when you have questions, please put them in the chat, and Lizzie will leave time for those at the end. This is being recorded, just so you know that. And Lizzie's going to leave 10 to 15 minutes for questions. And if there's not enough time for the questions, she'll see them all and we'll be able to answer them, and we can send the answer, well, get the answers back to you. So it gives me I'm really happy and excited to introduce Lizzie. Lizzie has done a Bachelor of Health Sciences at the University of Auckland, and she was my student in health promotion. So it's really lovely to see her here doing this work for Alcohol Health Watch, which is one of the very interesting and exciting health promotion agencies in the country. Lizzie focused on mental health and addiction in her health sciences, which is relevant to her family's experience of recovery. And her personal experiences guide her passion for prevention, social justice, and equity. And she really enjoys applying a health in all policies perspective through her work. Lizzie's originally from Waitakere, a Westie, which we also have in common, but she grew up in Katikati and now lives in Te Whanganui Atara in Wellington. In her spare time, you might want to ask her about this as well, she enjoys horse riding, going to the gym, reading, and keeping up with politics. Welcome, Lizzie, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Tēnā koe, Debbie, thank you so much. And kia ora, tēnā koutou katoa. Ko Lizzie Barrett tō koingoa, he uri tēnei no Ngāti Awa. First of all, thank you so much for sharing your time with me today. I mihi to you for the work that you do, and to everyone who's been impacted by the awful and widespread effects of sexual violence in Aotearoa. The topics I'll be discussing are complex and sensitive for a range of reasons, so if anything triggering surfaces over the next hour, please absolutely feel free to take a break or head off early and look after yourself. I'll start off by introducing Alcohol Health Watch and then get into the presentation. I was asked to provide an evidence update, so I put together everything I could find, but I'm definitely not going to get the time to go through it all today, so we can send the slides through to anyone interested. If you've never heard of us before, Alcohol Health Watch is a national charity that's been working to reduce and prevent alcohol-related harm since the late 1980s. It started with health promoters wanting a public health approach to alcohol at a time when our alcohol policy environment was becoming increasingly liberal. So like Debbie said, I'm based in Wellington, but the rest of the team on the photo on the slide are based in Newmarket in Tamaki Makaurau. And we're currently contracted by Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand to provide regional and national health promotion services in the key action areas you can see on the slide. And these definitions probably won't be news to you, but I wanted to use them to start this kōrero by saying that alcohol is never a cause or excuse for violence. The first definition on the slide is from the United Nations, and the second is from a report written to inform the Tangata Whenua Advisory Group for the Minister of the Prevention of Family Violence and Sexual Violence. And these definitions help us to understand that violence is structural, being embedded within our colonial and patriarchal institutions that impact us differently based on our gender, ethnicity, class, and other markers of privilege. But I'm not super keen on looking at alcohol's impacts on violence at the individual level today, because people have been doing that and debating that for a really long time. And we know that violence is ultimately about power and control. So today I want to discuss how alcohol intersects with these power imbalances. And like Debbie said, I'm really passionate about this kaupapa because I'm an adult child of an alcoholic. I've been privileged to be part of my mum's recovery journey and bring this perspective to ask how we can make it easier for people to heal, and more importantly, how we can prevent violence from happening in the first place. Because we know that violence can and does happen to anyone, but it's not evenly distributed, and it's often interconnected with complex intergenerational forms of adversity. When I first started looking into this during uni and found that substance abuse has historically been kept separate from our violence prevention strategies, plans, and infrastructure, I was disappointed but not super surprised. It makes a lot of sense thinking about the massive barriers to getting support for coexisting violence and substance abuse challenges, how hard it is to talk about violence involving alcohol, all the types of narratives that surface blaming women for drinking and excusing men for making a mistake. And of course, there's the long-standing debate between different sectors about whether alcohol causes violence or not. But the alcohol industry remains invisible in all these barriers, and that's also part of the problem. So I've tried to ground this presentation in evidence on the alcohol industry's structural influence on gendered violence, which should hopefully make more sense as I go through the slides, because it creates a clearer line of accountability and opportunities for prevention. And part of the reason why the alcohol industry has been invisible in these contexts for so long is because they've made it that way. Our health and social policies attempting to address alcohol-related harm are seriously lacking by international standards, particularly in terms of tax and advertising. Our alcohol regulatory framework is colonial, marginalises and excludes Māori leadership in Mātauranga, and drives significant inequities in alcohol-related harm between Māori and non-Māori. But the responsibility to prevent and reduce alcohol-related harm is consistently put on the government or communities, rather than appropriately regulating the industry as the source of harm itself. So alcohol is a commercial determinant of health, and alongside the tobacco, fossil fuel, and unhealthy food industries. And they're defined in the top box there as the systems, practices, and pathways through which commercial actors drive health and health equity. And we currently operate in a political context that heavily favours commercial over public interests. The alcohol industry strategies include political interference, advertising and promotion, funding biased research, and promoting narratives focused on individual drinkers and their ability to drink responsibly. Their links to government are pervasive internationally and in Aotearoa, with well-established relationships built on decades of financial donations, friendly relationships and gifts, and as these very recent articles show, regularly scheduled meetings with government officials. So the alcohol industry's had input on policies the public haven't even seen yet, including the Federal Alcohol Spectrum Disorder Action Plan, the Alcohol Levy Investment Framework, and our low-risk drinking guidelines. And the industry's strategies have implications for the prevention of sexual violence because of their relationship with hegemonic masculinity, which I'll explain a little bit about if you haven't heard of the term before. So hegemony is defined as the dominance of one social group over another, where the dominant group holds power and privilege that marginalizes others. This power imbalance is legitimized by our social norms, perceptions, and values, including what we expect and therefore don't question as natural, normal, or ideal. So hegemonic masculinity represents the practices and qualities that legitimate the privileging of men and the subordination of women. And as you can see on the slide, there are layers to this system. It's relational and subjugates other masculinities and behaviors that don't align with the cultural ideal. Connell's theory or triangle on the left is the most well known, and as you can see, women are excluded from it. But the triangle on the right extends this understanding, and it's from a thesis based in Aotearoa titled The Powerful Ones, which explored 12 young men's understandings of sexual violence and rape culture. Their perspectives were generally empathetic and well aligned with feminist understandings of violence perpetration, consent, and the broader social hierarchy influencing rape culture represented by that triangle, with white men at the top, followed by white women, queer white people, men and women of colour, queer men and women of colour, Māori men, Māori women, and takatapue. So understanding how the alcohol industry influences these hierarchies and the gendered drinking behaviours and norms that result from them is important to dismantling them. I'll come back to the thesis soon because it included some really interesting kōrero around alcohol's role in sexual violence. But I just want to quickly look at the alcohol industry's advertising and promotion strategies because they're probably the most obvious example of how they leverage gender to profit. These strategies are exploitative, designed to normalize alcohol as an expected part of everyday life, and use social context to link their products with harmful norms, like drinking to cope with discrimination. Male-oriented advertising has historically drawn on ideals associated with hegemonic masculinity through the idea that real men drink, with real men being those who are Pākehā, straight, physically and emotionally tough, assertive, independent, and hold dominance over women. Women have traditionally been portrayed as objects to be sexualized or as barriers to men's freedom to enjoy beer with the boys, as shown in the middle Jim Beam ad, which says, unlike your girlfriend, they never ask where this relationship is going. Interestingly, the more recent Man Up Spates ad in the top left there flips the script, drawing on emotional vulnerability to promote their product through the men's mental health movement Movember. This one is particularly performative given the links between alcohol and mental distress, and reinforces the status quo that men are only able to share their feelings with their male friends when they're drinking. I found this ad on Facebook, and it's just one of many forms of digital alcohol marketing which is being used to target younger audiences on social media platforms. Digital marketing is even more pervasive, difficult to regulate, and effective than traditional forms of marketing because people can engage with it through likes, comments, and shares. Algorithms can also use purchasing data to target heavier drinkers with more advertising, creating data loops for people to see more ads and buy more alcohol. This strategy has been termed limbic capitalism because it literally draws on the biological mechanisms of addiction to keep users engaged in driving their profits. But the alcohol industry also targets women and rainbow communities, which you can see on the Drink for Pink, Clean Collective, and Absolute ads on the slide. These ads are really great examples of pink washing, health washing, and rainbow washing, which all attempt to increase sales by signaling their brand support for an issue. But this support is ironic and exploitative given that industry's impacts on the issues they're attempting to profit off, like breast cancer in the Drink for Pink campaign. And alcohol advertising is prolific in Aotearoa because it's effectively unregulated. The Advertising Standards Authority is an industry-led self-regulatory body which oversees the Alcohol Advertising and Promotion Code. This code has been widely criticised for its ineffectiveness, and particularly in failing to protect children from unhealthy commodity marketing. The top left article is from a recent KidsCam study based in Wellington, where children aged between 11 and 13 years old were asked to wear cameras recording their exposure to unhealthy commodity advertising for 4 days a week. Researchers collected this data over 1 year and analysed it to find that alcohol marketing was the second most common type of exposure at an average of 5.7 times per day, although this data was collected in 2014 and 15 and therefore underestimates digital exposures. And while this study found no significant demographic differences in exposure, an older KidsCam study from 2018 found significantly higher exposure rates among rangatahi Māori and Pacific youth. And this advertising is causally linked to youth drinking earlier and heavier and increases the risk of having drinking problems when they're older. But this influence is strongly linked to hegemonic masculinity, as discussed by the middle two articles on this slide, which outline how the alcohol industry targets men by leveraging the masculine ideals I mentioned before. Sports sponsorship is a particularly effective gateway for the alcohol industry to profit by reaching global audiences, and because masculine behaviours involving strength, aggression, and competitiveness often translate from the sports field to binge drinking as a social practice. Research interviewing local sports club members found that sexism, misogyny, and physical aggression often proliferate in these drinking environments. But these aspects of drinking have become so normalized that males are oblivious to how they might be causing harm and think that everyone is treated equally. In contrast, people who stray for the norm, such as women, non-Pākehā people, and people who don't drink, are acutely aware of these dynamics, being made to feel alienated and not given the same social opportunities as the dominant group. At the local level, club sponsorship is broadly perceived as a major and heavily relied upon funding source, meaning that these norms are difficult to change for risk of impacting the club's social and physical functioning. But the links between sport and violence are well evidenced. Research shows that the excitement, disappointment, and adrenaline from watching a team play can compound existing tensions within a relationship, resulting in violence that's often worse when alcohol's involved. The most comprehensive study on this relationship so far was based in England and found that football games literally changed the dynamics of domestic abuse, with a 5% decrease in abuse incidents while the games were on and an increase in abuse between current partners beginning directly after the game and peaking between 10 and 12 hours later. And researchers attributed this increase to alcohol-involved violence. And while these links haven't been well researched in Aotearoa, we know anecdotally that this relationship causes serious harms to our women and rangatahi, and research does show that our sports are absolutely saturated with alcohol advertising. The top right article, not the top right article, the bottom left article is local research on alcohol sports sponsorship during the summer of 2014 and 15, which identified alcohol brands present during every televised sports event, exposing audiences to advertising between 1.6 and 3.8 times every minute. Alcohol brands were observed between 42 and 777 times a game, and in 3 of the 5 sports analysed, alcohol sponsorship was visible for almost half the broadcast. We can also see alcohol's physical or environmental influence on gendered power dynamics, with alcohol outlet density being linked to crime, including sexual assault, and alcohol consistently being identified as the most commonly used drug to facilitate sexual assault. But again, these harms aren't evenly distributed because bottle shops are often clustered in our most deprived areas, which increases competition, intensifies alcohol advertising, and drives the sale of cheaper alcohol. This relationship positions alcohol as a compounding factor within our colonial systems, impacting overlapping forms of disadvantage such as discrimination, financial insecurity and poverty, racism, violence, and trauma. And all of these strategies are designed to maximize profits by encouraging heavy and widespread alcohol consumption, and it works with nearly half of all alcohol consumed in heavy drinking occasions. And the industry strategies are also linked by individual responsibility narratives that they work hard to promote, which reinforces the systemic disconnect between and widespread silence on substance abuse and gendered violence as a major public health challenge in Aotearoa. The next couple of slides show key findings from the thesis I mentioned before, exploring young men's perceptions of alcohol and consent in rape culture. More broadly, the most agreed upon contributing factor to sexual violence was power and control, with discussions including a strong structural analysis of masculinities, male entitlement, sexual competitiveness, the objectification of women, and the normalization of sexual violence as forming interconnected mechanisms that produce and sustain rape culture. Similarly, inequities in sexual violence between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people were situated within the ongoing process of colonisation, driven by the imposition of Pākehā gender norms, suppression of mātauranga Māori and tikanga, active marginalisation and disempowerment, and the removal of traditional healing and conflict resolution methods. But interestingly, discussions on alcohol strayed away from these structural causes and instead focused on its individual impacts on intoxication and consent, although its influence on rape myths and victim-blaming discourse were also discussed. Some participants held binary perceptions, considering any level of alcohol as impacting people's capacity to consent. But 6 out of 11 young men perceived alcohol as operating through a spectrum of intoxication, meaning the more impaired someone is, the less able they are to engage in consent negotiation, with the capacity to consent being placed somewhere on the scale on the right-hand side of the slide. But these perspectives position alcohol as the influential power dynamic dictating inequalities rather than gender, which leaves no room to consider how violence operates within people's relationships. And this positioning is problematic because it assumes that men and women hold equal amounts of power in the first place. But they also reflect the messaging that the industry works to promote throughout our society, that alcohol is a normal, unquestionable part of our culture and that people should deal with their own alcohol-related problems. This messaging magnifies harmful beliefs associated with sexual violence, where alcohol justifies male perpetration because he didn't know what he was doing, and women are vilified because she should have known better. This discourse also reinforces the myth that women lie about their experiences, or that they shouldn't be believed if it's going to ruin someone's life over a silly mistake. And the widespread perception that alcohol blurs the lines between what's legally and morally acceptable ultimately reduces male accountability and silences women. The disconnect between alcohol and gendered power dynamics reduces our collective understandings and responsibility to address this challenge. And together, these interconnected factors enable alcohol's contribution to the burden and severity of sexual violence to proliferate. I'm going to skip over that slide just to keep to time, but it discusses attitudes to rape myths involving alcohol in the 2021 NCAS, which is an Australian survey on community attitudes towards violence against women. And we have something similar here called the Aotearoa Gender Attitude Survey, which is undertaken every 2 years to see how we're tracking in terms of achieving gender inequality, marked by people's opinions on genders and gender and sexual diversity. The 2023 survey aimed to compare past results, identify any new and emerging trends, and key differences by gender, age, and ethnicity. And social metrics indicating the achievement of gender equality included more stories about women's sports, less gender stereotyping in the media, and reductions in domestic violence, sexual violence, and suicide rates, and reductions in drug and alcohol abuse. Males were more likely to agree than females for most of these metrics, but the gap was smallest for a reduction in drug and alcohol abuse, meaning that relatively more women agree this is an important measure. The only question asking for people's opinions on alcohol involves sexual violence, measured agreement with the statement, if someone is raped when they're drunk, they're at least partly responsible for what happens. And overall agreement with this statement has increased by 2% since 2019, which isn't statistically significant, but males were far more likely to agree than females. And it's concerning that these trends are looking like they are moving upwards because agreement with other statements have also increased slightly since 2019, with the highest increase in agreement for the statement that rape happens when a man's sex drive is out of control. There are also differences by context and setting, with international evidence showing that sexual violence is more likely to be perpetrated in contexts where both perpetrator and victim are drinking, such as parties and bars. In these contexts, men often encourage women to consume excess alcohol to facilitate sexual assault, and these men are more likely to be acquaintances or friends known to women than strangers in comparison to survivors of sexual assault where alcohol and other drugs aren't involved. Most sexual assaults on college campuses involve alcohol consumption, and alcohol's role in party culture, casual sex, and its influence on behaviours and judgment in these contexts is consistently linked to sexual assault. And alcohol-affected perpetrators are more likely to use force and cause injuries to women. I've intentionally put the individual level evidence towards the end of these slides to try and show that violence itself is the downstream product of the alcohol industry's upstream strategies within our gendered systems. Western or scientific evidence at this level has traditionally been grounded in biomedical perspectives, which link alcohol to individual violence through its impacts on inhibition, impulsivity, and social information processes. And this focus on alcohol itself as a causal or risk factor for violence hasn't been very successful, both for prevention or intervention, because it excludes gender from the conversation. But more recent evidence accounting for social circumstances, masculinities, and the power imbalances underpinning them is more promising. These perspectives enable the connections between alcohol consumption, male privilege, and the entrapment and disenfranchisement of women to be more clearly understood and addressed. When male alcohol use is interconnected with repeated cycles of abuse, alcohol becomes a tool of control by shaping the behaviours and strategies women use to protect themselves. It also often ties into economic abuse and codependence due to the expectations put on women to take responsibility for their partner and the responsibility put on women to escape, especially when kids are involved, rather than on men to examine and address their behaviours or the inequalities that underpin them. I also want to acknowledge that the alcohol industry's strategies interact with our neo-colonial systems to drive cycles of harm. These cycles of harm are also gendered, but it's important to articulate how male addiction or substance abuse, manipulation, obsession, entitlement, and control or perceived loss of control are commonly intertwined and occur in a backdrop of trauma and violence they've experienced themselves. So alcohol's two-sided role in these cycles can help us extend this understanding, given that it both exaggerates harmful masculinities and is used as a response to the demands, expectations, and ideals of them. The diagram on the left is from the Family Violence Death Review Committee's 6th report titled Men Who Use Violence, which provides an overview of the lives of 97 men who used violence against their intimate partners between 2009 and 2017. The report discusses these men's experiences in the context of colonisation as it continues to underpin social and structural violence and discrimination and indifference and inaction to address this violence, ultimately driving the intergenerational transmission of complex trauma through exposure to child maltreatment, interpersonal aggression and violence, mental health challenges, and substance abuse for both settlers and Indigenous communities. 38% of the men involved in this report had one or more recorded mental health concerns that required mental health or drug and alcohol services to be involved. Drug and alcohol problems were the second most type of mental health concern, falling only behind other concerns and followed by suicidality and depression and anxiety. The diagram on the right similarly lists cyclical risk factors for experiencing or perpetrating intimate partner violence by age 25. And these findings from the Christchurch longitudinal study also found that IPV occurred in 70% of the relationships among study participants. The Death Review Committee report notes that people have the capacity to move away from violence through holistic services, addressing overlapping factors including drug and alcohol abuse. And it also acknowledges that men can and do use violence without experiencing these factors. But it also found that excess alcohol consumption by the aggressor, the victim, or both featured in nearly half of intimate partner violence death events in Aotearoa. And although research on alcohol and sexual violence is extremely lacking, the evidence we do have is generally focused on female victim survivors rather than male perpetrators. Alcohol also often has a two-way relationship across these cycles of harm, where it both facilitates and is used as a coping mechanism for sexual violence. Obviously, these factors are different for everyone, but these are some of the common ones that researchers have linked together, and I'm sure they're not news to anyone on this call or anyone who works with victim survivors who will be seeing them on a daily basis. Research from Women's Refuge in Aotearoa shows that over half of women accessing their services have been prevented from accessing health, counselling, or addiction services. 11% have been forced to use substances, and 15% have been forced to stop using contraception. But a scoping review of women's experiences of substance use and alcohol and other drug services shows that our systems aren't well set up to address these overlaps, with key findings including that women facing alcohol and other drug issues are often undermined, dismissed, and not given appropriate support. And key barriers to this support include institutional racism, stigma, discrimination, unclear and unhelpful information, and the lack of treatment providers that are tailored towards women or able to address family violence. Mothers often face higher levels of scrutiny for drinking alcohol than fathers, and they also face higher barriers to support services while pregnant or parenting for fear of being reported or having their children uplifted by child protection services. Controlling violent or absent partners who misuse substances impact women's access to and use of alcohol and other drugs, and their ability to engage with support services. And it also found that gendered norms relating to femininity and motherhood shape women's substance use, which is interlinked with the alcohol industry's heavy targeting of women through mummy wine culture, which normalizes alcohol as a coping mechanism for being a parent. And also the advertising that kind of promotes ideas of female empowerment and independence, and which all just layers on the increasingly competing demands in women's lives as we gain our independence from men. And another study came out while I was making this presentation, which found that over 2/3 of women had experienced violence in their lifetimes in Aotearoa, and 21% of this violence involved childhood sexual abuse. The study also linked experiencing violence to poor health outcomes and substance abuse, with violence significantly increasing the risk of hospitalization for a range of health conditions, including cancer and respiratory diseases. All of which means that alcohol's impacts on gender inequality in Aotearoa are a major human rights and health equity issue, with implications for sexual violence prevention and other interconnected challenges such as fetal alcohol spectrum disorder and maternal suicide. Gendered violence is often described as an epidemic in this country, and with sexual violence being perpetrated against 1 in 3 women in their lifetimes, we should be doing anything and everything possible to reduce this burden of harm. Local data signals the strong overlap between alcohol harm and sexual violence, with the New Zealand Crime and Victims Survey finding that violent crime is more likely to be perpetrated against young people, people living with disabilities, and Takatapui and Rainbow people. These communities are also consistently impacted by higher rates of heavy drinking in New Zealand Health Survey findings. Research also strongly demonstrates that alcohol-related harm disproportionately impacts Wahine Māori, who experience the most harm from other people's drinking than any other ethnic group in Aotearoa. In this context, the alcohol industry's targeting of young people, deprived communities, women and men, and rainbow communities is disgusting. And the study is from 2009, but it found that over half of all physical and sexual assaults involved a perpetrator who had been drinking. Most alcohol-related sexual assaults were perpetrated in bars, pubs, or clubs, but it was closely followed by those perpetrated in people's own homes. It also found that higher rates of sexual assault were perpetrated against females, Māori, young people, and people who drank alcohol more frequently or more than 6 drinks on one occasion. I'm going to skip the slides on international research in the interest of time, but key findings include that alcohol-facilitated sexual assault is usually perpetrated by males who know their victims, who are current or former partners, in private spaces, including their own homes, and through opportunistic means by assaulting women who have already been drinking rather than actively drugging them. Alcohol and drug-facilitated sexual assault is also more likely to be perpetrated against women experiencing mental health challenges. And there's a strong relationship between this assault and poor mental health outcomes, particularly PTSD, depression, and suicidal ideation. In Aotearoa, sexual violence is the strongest risk factor for harmful drinking among youth, and the earlier these cycles of harm begin, the more difficult they are to escape from. And I'm going to skip through the next few slides because they just list more individual level evidence. And I'd be really interested to hear if this aligns with your experiences, but I'm going to keep on track for time. So I want to quickly discuss this Angel Shots poster intervention, which came from a study based in Dunedin. The study investigated sexual violence committed by people not in a familial or intimate relationship, so a neighbour, friend, or other non-relative acquaintance or strangers to the victim, and found that alcohol was involved in up to 80% of these cases. And the intervention they decided on from this research were these posters, which were developed as a health promotion resource aiming to decrease rates of sexual assault in the community, by increasing awareness and personal safety. If you haven't seen them before, they're usually in women's bathrooms and encourage us to alert bartenders to remove us from dangerous situations. And these types of interventions really reflect the individual level focus in the thesis I mentioned before, where alcohol omits gendered power imbalances from the conversation and puts the responsibility on women to get help or manage their drinking, rather than holding men accountable to not perpetrate violence in the first place. I've certainly never heard of toasters in men's bathrooms raising awareness of alcohol's impacts on consent. But it just goes to show how ingrained this individual level focus is and how that translates from research into our practice. Another study I found investigating toxicological assessments of alcohol and drug facilitated sexual assaults in Aotearoa concluded that the major cause of these assaults was victims knowingly taking alcohol or recreational drugs in combination with medicinal drugs, particularly antidepressants and antipsychotics, and subsequent impairment of judgment or consent to sexual activity, rather than men not knowing the boundaries between what's right and wrong, and not knowing how drugs and alcohol influence people's ability to give consent. But then again, we can't educate our way out of these systemic challenges, which is why a comprehensive primary prevention-based approach to addressing the alcohol industry's impacts on gender inequality is so important. And alcohol regulations are often discussed as upstream or primary prevention measures by the simple logic that reducing alcohol availability reduces violence and vice versa. But these discussions often leave gender out of the conversation. And this report is Australian, but it analyses how these discussions have put male alcohol-related violence in the too hard basket, but because people see it as an entrenched part of our culture stemming from unchangeable masculine traits. While alcohol-related violence is broadly recognised as a gendered issue, the public health sector often steps back from responding to it by prioritising universal interventions that apply equally to all people, like reducing alcohol outlet trading hours or banning advertising. And these processes omit masculinity from the conversation, prevent scrutiny of the alcohol industry's impacts on systems of male privilege, and reinforce these systems by positioning femininity as other to the unspoken male norm. So women are positioned as vulnerable objects, rainbow communities are generally excluded altogether, and all people are asked to shoulder the responsibility for addressing male drinking and violence rather than men. But recent reviews from Australia and Ireland show that this is a misperception, because addressing alcohol's commercial influence is an important part of ensuring that women, children, and our future generations can live free from violence. In Australia, decades of work with survivor advocates have resulted in Prime Minister Anthony Albanese committing to action on alcohol and violence prevention efforts. And this action has involved law reforms making domestic violence prevention a primary objective of alcohol regulations, and including provisions to better protect people from the increasing violence resulting from online alcohol sales and delivery. Unfortunately, last week, our Associate Minister for Justice, Nicole McKee, made a pretty disappointing announcement on alcohol law reforms, recognising that responsible drinkers should not be penalised because of few who do not drink safely. The proposed reforms make it harder for communities to oppose liquor licenses, allow hairdressers to sell alcohol without a licence, and make it easier for pubs and clubs to serve alcohol outside of normal trading hours, such as for major sporting events. The only harm reduction measure involves regulating rapid alcohol delivery, and a cabinet paper was leaked the week before this announcement, demonstrating that the minister had almost entirely ditched the Ministry of Justice's recommendations, including a 1 hour reduction in trading hours that could have prevented 2,400 violent victimisations every year, in favour of these reforms reducing red tape for businesses. Apparently, the minister doesn't have confidence in the Ministry of Data on the potential for trading hour restrictions to reduce violence, but she does believe New Zealand crime and victim survey data showing that alcohol-related offences are decreasing. And the entire situation, and particularly the personal responsibility narratives used to justify this U-turn, reeks of alcohol industry lobbying and is an absolute kick in the teeth to victim survivors of violence in Aotearoa. But it does create some opportunities for us to work together to reverse this U-turn. The opportunities for action I've included in this presentation focus on gender-responsive alcohol harm reduction, which means actively and explicitly engaging with gender in alcohol policy, theory, research, and practice. We have a good idea of what this could look like locally through equity-driven approaches, upholding te tiriti, and kaupapa Māori solutions, including by recognising gender through Te Ao Māori perspectives. Having higher regulatory standards for alcohol advertising, especially for sporting events, is also a really promising prevention tool. But these policies will be extremely difficult to implement without first addressing the alcohol industry's political interference, which is why I've put the Health Coalition Aotearoa's very timely lobbying campaign on this slide. Key action areas are aimed at making lobbying more transparent, managing conflicts of interest, tightening restrictions on political donations, and slowing the revolving door between lobbyists and government. I'd strongly recommend signing up to the campaign and spreading the word because they're developing an open letter that will come out soon, and it'll be awesome to get as many people involved as possible. And this slide lists some more opportunities for action aligning with the Ottawa Charter for Health Promotion, which is focused on equitable, coordinated, and intersectoral action, ensuring that all people can achieve their highest possible level of health and well-being. These are pretty high-level actions, but I'd love to hear what you think about them and really just keep the kōrero going about key priority areas, existing successful prevention or intervention strategies, and especially if you think I've left anything out that we could offer each other with. And I can't emphasize the importance of grounding these efforts in lived experience, not just to guide meaningful and effective action, but because the alcohol industry's voices have been the loudest in these conversations for too long. We need to rebalance the focus away from these mythical responsible drinkers who shouldn't be penalised for the few who can't control themselves. And one of the most effective ways we can do this is by amplifying each other's voices to tell decision makers that we've had enough, that these harms can and do happen to anyone, that our binge drinking culture is still prolific, and that our women and children shouldn't be the ones bearing this burden of harm. So I'm coming to the end of the presentation now, and there's some more kind of specific strategies in there, I guess. But in summary, it's time we held the alcohol industry accountable for their impacts on healthy environments, relationships, and gender norms in Aotearoa. We're keen to work together in any way possible, even just by keeping the kōrero going, the changes we'd like to see. If you're based in Waitakere, we also have an opportunity for you to get involved in our community mobilisation project, which is aimed at strengthening people's participation in alcohol policy processes. It's being funded by Te Whatu Ora Health New Zealand for 2 years, and it's focused on the workforces most impacted by alcohol-related harm, such as yourselves and people working in the family violence, social, alcohol and other drug, mental health or housing sectors, as experts who should have a say on alcohol's influence on their mahi. It's grounded in collaboration and co-design, and we're not throwing these terms around lightly because we've got Louise Kirkwood, our amazing evaluator, who suggested a developmental evaluation approach applying the Hotu Waka theory of change, because we want the project to be grounded in community leadership, priorities, relationships, and values. And we ultimately want the project to contribute to alcohol policy processes that are fairer, safer, and reflect and uphold community input, both now and for future generations. And I'm going to end on this quote from the Australian report I mentioned just before, which I think sums it up pretty nicely. Without sustained attention to the issues identified in this report, and without the changes in alcohol research and policy they warrant, the power relationships reproduced through enactments of masculinity and implicated in alcohol and violence will continue to go unmarked, and the kinds of change required of men will remain unthinkable. So that's all from me. So I'll pass back to Debbie. My contact details are there, and we can send you the slides if you want them, and we can do questions if there are any. Thank you so much again.
Thank you, Lizzie. That was so full of information and really, really interesting. Thank you very much. Ruth, you've been looking at the chat, and are there questions in the chat?
Yeah, well, there is one question about the slides that Lizzie said that they can be provided later. So it will be great to know how they will be, how people can either request or how we will provide to them. Do you have any?
Alison, will you be sending the slides out?
Yes, I can forward them out to everyone.
Okay. That's it.
Alison, I wonder, because there's relatively few people, if it's possible to have a discussion or not.
I will just check the settings to see if we can unmute everyone.
Yeah. In the meantime, if anyone would like to put a question in the chat. I have a question, Lizzie, because there was so much. Thank you, Maggie, and I see you've got one next. There was so much information in here, and I'm catching up from what I've known in the past. And you've made a strong connection between sort of negative masculinities and alcohol. My understanding always was that alcohol doesn't cause violence, that you have to have the intention towards violence, and that you can sort of move to another level of violence through the disinhibiting properties of alcohol or using that as an excuse. But you seem to indicate that there was some new research on that. Can you just talk about that a bit more, please?
Yeah, sure. I think it's just the kind of newer stuff that's come out talking about how there is obviously not all men who use violence are under the influence of alcohol and other drugs. So there's that kind of narrative that no matter what we do about alcohol, it's not a silver bullet for violence prevention. But there is a massive amount of violence that is alcohol attributable, or, alcohol is a contributing factor that, yeah, if we could take alcohol out of the equation, it wouldn't be happening. And the kind of, that's why researchers are kind of putting us towards this public policy focus rather than the individual focus, because if we can reduce alcohol availability, but if we are trying to link that in with gendered violence, then we need to monitor its impact on these gendered behaviors. And also these kind of approaches to it can't be one or the other. It should be, both those downstream and those upstream measures contributing to non-violent environments, the same as, any other kind of primary prevention intervention.
Thank you. Thanks, Alison. So we have a question from Maggie.
Yes. First of all, I want to tell you that mixing cameras are now activated if anybody want to do any question. Maggie said, do you see hopeful signs in Aotearoa?
Yeah, I do. We've been working with Amelia Fletcher from West Auckland Anti-Violence Essential Services, and there's this kind of growing willingness to talk about it, I think, in the sector, of people saying, we've had enough, we're seeing this all the time, we need to do something about it. But in terms of primary prevention, it's kind of hard to know what that looks like, because it's just, the sector very broadly isn't well resourced, and then prevention is kind of a whole nother issue of resourcing as well. So yeah, I think it's just about collaboration and keeping working towards the changes that we want to see, and to a future where women are better protected against violence here.
There's another one. Are there any difference between sexual violence against adults versus children in alcohol usage?
The evidence on different age groups, there is like in the slides, there's an article which researchers have found that 11.4% of child maltreatment in Aotearoa is alcohol attributable, and that this rises to 17% among rangatahi Māori. But then there's the research, I guess, from adults from 2009, which says that over half of all physical and sexual assaults involved alcohol. But then in terms of the kind of alcohol use after that as a coping mechanism, I'm not sure. Like, I would say that the kind of trend would be commonly, sexual violence. There's a really high relationship between sexual violence and then consequent alcohol use. So the earlier that starts, I guess the higher the risk. But yeah, I hope that answers that.
Thanks, Lizzie. I was just kind of wondering about the perpetration thereof. Is there more likelihood for the perpetration of abuse against children to be alcohol driven as it is, for adults? Because there's kind of slightly different ways in which that goes about, I guess. I'm just interested to know, is there any data on that?
Yeah, I'm not sure. Apart from those two kind of pieces of research that we have, there's not a lot. And
Clarify. Because we quite often hear about the correlation between alcohol and abuse, and I'm never convinced, I'm not completely sure, is it the person has alcohol and does the abuse, or the person has had alcohol and is the victim of the abuse? If that makes sense. So those kind of distinctions. Yes, alcohol sort of plays a really big role all round, but exactly who's it influencing more particularly, or kind of all the same?
Yeah, that's a good point.
It's a very good point, Maggie. This is something that you can see in the ethnic community, especially in South America. Most of the sexual violence cases, rape at the home from the perpetrators are when they are under the influence of the alcohol. And it can happen between friends or between family. And we have a big number in children from 5 years old can be affected. And there we have the statistics. Unfortunately, I didn't see in Aotearoa.
Well, I guess just anecdotally speaking, we would see probably two categories, and I don't know the proportions, to be honest. I'd have to do some work to find that out. But where abuse of children definitely is happening as a result of, alcohol influence and partying and lack of protection and things that result from party houses, or people who drink alcohol, regularly, and people who also there's a large group of people who it's childhood sexual abuse in particular is very calculated and very planned, and those people are mostly stone cold sober. So, I mean, not to say that the other group isn't calculated and planned as well, but it's just kind of, I'm wondering what the influence is on managing behaviours, like if we got people to not be under the influence, what influence might that have, when inhibitions are all down. I'm kind of just trying to understand a little bit about what role we know it plays a really big role in inhibition lowering, and what are the other roles, so we kind of can unpeel that behaviour, because we need to understand those drivers and that behaviour to change things, to change attitudes and thinking.
Yeah, I think it's also definitely that perception that women are more of an easy target when they've been drinking as well. So it's that kind of biological thing, and then that social layer to it as well.
Of course. So there's kind of more than a number of things to look at in what leads to victimisation, I guess, is all I'm trying to say. So great to get all your information and your data. It's a really rich presentation and lots to chew over there. But I also feel like there's just so much more detail to learn, isn't there?
Yes.
Do we have more questions, comments for Lizzie?
No, we don't. We are almost at the end of our.
Anyone want to ask something?
Or add a comment?
Oh.
My name's Andrew. I'm Lizzie's boss at Alcohol Health Watch, and I just want to say well done, Lizzie, and well done, Debbie, on obviously giving Lizzie that amazing teaching. This, as Lizzie pointed out, this law reform package will be going through the public consultation process probably late this year, just before Christmas. If I was a betting man, the government likes to put through changes that are submitted on over Christmas when people are busy. But we need everyone who can come in and after our calls for less availability and really highlight the role that alcohol plays. And like Lizzie said, that the voice of lived experience can be massively powerful. It has been in Australia with our colleagues. So I just encourage you to reach out to Lizzie or me or our team. And thank you for hosting this really important discussion. Kia ora.
Thank you, Andrew. And so, Lizzie, maybe you can send Alison links to the different health promotion initiatives you were talking about so that people can, and also a way to keep in touch so that people know when it's time to submit on that piece of legislation would be useful. Thank you. Because I'm sure if people are interested in it, they'll want to be involved in that. Yeah, thank you. Well, thank you all very much for coming. Thank you, Lizzie, for all of the work that you've done. It's really exciting to see you putting so many different ideas and concepts together to help us understand that what is not a straightforward direct link between these things. And I've really appreciated the way that you've done it, and I'm sure everyone else has too. And so thank you again. I'll ask Ruth to close for us.
Yes.
Thanks so much, Debbie, and thank you, Ruth, and thanks for having me and for your time today. It's been really great.
Right. Unuhuya, unuhuya, unuhuya. Ki te uru, tapu, nui, kia watea, kia mama, tēnā kau, te tinana, te wairua, I te ara, takata, koia, ra erongo. Whakairaia, ake runga, kia tina, huie, taikie. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.